Hi everyone, this is Mrs. Fitzgerald. I'm going to be taking history for all of stage 2 for the next 2 weeks so that, well, I really love teaching history, and also it just makes our time while we're all at home because of COVID-19, it makes it a bit easier if we're just recording the one lesson. Now, we're going to start with an overview of what our history lesson is going to be about. So in term 1, it's called The First Contacts, and we'll learn about the conditions in Australia and Britain before the First Fleet arrived and the voyage of the First Fleet to Australia. And when they get to Australia will be about the end of term 2, and then we'll go on to do some more work about the settling of Australia in term 3. So a fleet is a group of ships that brought, in this case, the First Fleet brought the convicts, the soldiers and free settlers up to Australia from Britain. And when we talk about a colony, it's a settlement of people, and the settlement is still under the laws of the original country. So in this case, the settlers were from England, and so they were still under the law of England, and that's the definition of a colony. Okay, I'm going to go into share with you now a PowerPoint, which will be the background for what I'm talking about. And here's our title for this lecture, is the traditional Australian Aboriginal lifestyle before the British settlement. So let's just have a look at an overview of our lessons first. This is our first lesson, and the other lessons in this term will be the culture of the traditional Aboriginal people, the trade routes and the early explorers before Captain Cook, Captain Cook's expedition to Australia, conditions in Britain during the 18th century, preparing for the First Fleet, the voyage of the First Fleet and the arrival of the First Fleet in Botany Bay and moving to Port Jackson. Our learning intention is to understand how the Australian Aboriginal people lived before British colonisation. And if we're successful at that, we will be able to describe how the Aboriginal people lived in shelters, found food and made tools. And you should be able to explain how we know how the Australian Aboriginal people lived. So the evidence that we use to know that this is true. Let's start off by looking at an image. This was a drawing done by people when they first arrived in Sydney Harbour, called Port Jackson. That's its official name, it's Port Jackson. Okay, and in this picture you can see the Aboriginal people on the south side of Sydney Harbour. They called themselves the Gadigal people, so people from around Paddington and all the way out to some of the eastern suburbs were called the Gadigal people. And this picture shows a family of Aboriginal people at their home in Port Jackson. And they live in a cave beside the water. And the Aboriginal people who lived in the Sydney area were not nomadic. Okay, they didn't move on to different feeding grounds. They had plenty of food where they were and were able to stay in one place. They had shelters made from rocks, sticks and bark. In this case, it was a cave. During the warm months, the Aboriginal people often slept outside and they didn't wear clothes. So as we look at more of these drawings, you might see some naked people. It's a part of our history. I hope you'll be mature enough to understand that it was perfectly acceptable to those people. To keep warm during the colder months, however, the Aboriginal people wore animal skins and they lit fires which they kept burning all night. Okay, this picture is showing some sketches of other types of shelters that Aboriginal people built. The shelters have many different names depending on the language groups. They might be called a humpy or a gunya. In this drawing, there are 2 huts made from sticks and bark. A shelter like this would be common around the Sydney area and many of the other areas as well. You can see there's one here with a fire in the front and another one here, sticks holding it up with the bark, often the bark of a paper tree, around keeping the wind out and keeping any rain off it. Our next picture is in what would have been more of the northern, these structures here. You can see there's one there, there's one at the back there, there's another one over here. These shelters vary a lot because of, well, shelters across Australia vary a lot because we have such a wide range of climates, the weather conditions in all the areas. So in the north of Australia, they have a lot of, they have some monsoon weather, which means very heavy rain falling for periods of time. And so these shelters were built to be able to withstand those monsoon rains. Okay, these shelters, you can see it looks more like a desert. There are some trees out on the edges there and a little bit of vegetation at the front. However, these types of shelters were more likely for people in the desert areas of Australia, and would have been designed so that they could also provide shade for the people during the hot part of the day. And this shelter is called a dome hut, and these types of shelters were common in Tasmania. The weather is a lot colder down in Tasmania and some areas are very windy. And these shelters were much bigger and stronger than most of the Aboriginal shelters on the mainland. They were able to house a whole family. They had a fire in the middle. You can see that there's a built-up edge around the outside where they're sitting. There's a fire in the middle where they do their cooking and keep themselves warm. There's a hole, it's a bit hard to see here, there's a hole in the roof so that the smoke is going straight out the top. It's not filling up the hut with smoke, and there would be some fresh air coming in through the doorway. Okay, I'm going to finish that part of our video now. I've broken this video up into 4 pieces so that it's not quite so long. You can choose to watch them all at once if you would like. They just continue on from each other, then there'll be an activity to do at the end of it. Thank you, everyone. And I'll just finish up.